Damn, that music always gets me. But
It's
hello,
yeah.
everybody, and welcome to episode 20 of Unsung Heroes of the Cloud, where today I'm joined by Lior Kamrad, and we'll be talking all about Azure Arc, Azure Arc Jumpstart, and Azure Arcbox. And with that, Lior, welcome.
How's it going, Nils? It's been a while.
Yeah, I'm doing well. It definitely has been a while. I remember, I think it was about a year ago that we did some work together on the
Yeah,
Arc Jumpstart.
yeah. A lot of things happened since
Yeah,
then.
so I've heard. But before we jump into technology, let's maybe talk a little bit about you. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, thanks, Nils. So my name is Lior Kamrat. Currently at Microsoft for 6.5 years, going strong now. And my current role is the worldwide technical strategy lead for everything that is Azure Hybrid, basically part of our customer success unit. The way I like to always describe this is that my job, the things that I'm waking up in the morning with and going to sleep with, is to try to make our field awesome by creating a lot of technical content. Advocacy is somewhat of a beat down word, but a lot of advocacy when it comes to the things that I'm working on. But yeah, I'm working a lot on the product and things that's got to do with Azure Arc. So yeah, that's why I
Okay.
am.
And we'll touch on Arc in a second, but I think some people in the audience might want to hear about one of your earlier jobs at Microsoft because you used to work with an idol of the community. You used to work with Marko Sinovic directly.
Yeah. Mark used to be my manager, my skip manager, and I was what we called here in Microsoft technical advisor or technical assistant.
Hmm.
Um, and this role is really about uh, making sure that he looks great on stage by creating a lot of the technical demos that he's doing, and kind of owning that process of how those demos are going to look like, what will be the flow, working with the product managers, working with all the different technologies. And one of the biggest challenge with this is that obviously Mark, he's got a lot of he's got high standards, but also the
Uh-huh.
fact that a lot of the time the demos that we've been doing are things that are new. There's no information out there on these technologies, so you really need to extract a lot, by yourself and by working with the product. So yeah.
Okay. And is there one demo that you are exceptionally proud of that he demonstrated at like Ignite or Builds?
Yeah, wow, great question. I think we did the one that we did with the face recognition, that we had Microsoft Kinect, like the camera,
Uh-huh.
and that was before even releasing that Kinect. And he had like we did an AI face recognition, cognitive services kind of mesh of a lot of
Yeah.
technologies. We did this demo while we were doing face recognition on Satya Face and Corey Sanders and Scott Godfrey and Amy Hood. That was kind of funny. So I mean that's a demo that I remember. There are many others that we
Yeah.
did, but yeah, that was the one that pops, top of mind for me.
Yeah. And talking about demos, what you've been doing with Azure Arc Jumpstart sounds a lot like building a lot of demos that people either at Microsoft or customers of
Mm.
ours can reuse for Arc. But before we get into Jumpstart, why don't we touch upon Arc for a second and explain what's
Yeah.
Azure Arc?
Yeah, Azure Arc is it's a really interesting space. I've been working on Azure Arc for 3 years now, and obviously I've seen a lot of that, a lot of its evolution. If you're thinking about Azure Arc, one of the things that I always like to say is take a step back and think about Azure for a second. Azure was born with hybrid in mind, but I always also think that it's a bit too marketish slogan to say. So the way I like to explain is that um, at the early days, we had site-to-site VPNs, we have network connectivity, and then everyone thought that, oh, that's hybrid cloud. Fast forward in few years, and we all know that's not really what hybrid cloud is all about. Then we came with Azure Stack, which had some adoption, had some problems. It was very it still is a very if we're talking about Azure Stack, not Azure Stack HCI, Azure Stack was really kind of hardware-oriented solution that you need to land in your data center. So you need to have those specific use cases to do that. But then we came up with Azure Arc and Azure Stack HCI and all that suite of products. And I think that the main difference here is that that's the first time that we, as Microsoft, we actually started to do this solution with a software API implementation in mind, kind of from a control plane point of view. So it wasn't just about network connectivity. It was really about bringing resources and assets to our control plane, and also being able to deploy those assets outside of Azure, which it's based on Kubernetes with app services, data services, all this type of stuff. But that's really kind of the evolution there. So for people that are new to this space, the way I like to talk about this is that Azure Arc is really about software-based hybrid cloud solution, meaning that this is stretching the control plane of Azure. And a lot of the time, I also like to say that Azure Resource Manager, and I think you know this as much as I do, Azure Resource Manager is the operating system of Azure. That's the brain.
Yes.
Right? So stretching that operating system to places that you don't control as Microsoft, that's really the magic. And that's how I like to think about Azure Arc specifically.
So it's an interesting way to put it, because I had never considered what you just said, because as you think about the original Azure Stack, it was about extending ARM into your data center where you could deploy using the same APIs, but it required you to deploy a big set of hardware and you couldn't reuse your existing assets. Whereas now with Arc, you can get the Azure API and some of the benefits from that on your existing hardware and on your existing machine. So I like that evolution that you painted.
Yeah, and I think that's really the premise of Azure Arc. We like to say again, this space is filled with buzzwords from here all the way to to Japan. But if you're thinking about the concept of not being disruptive, that's really what this is all about, because you're taking advantage of your current investments, right? We don't care if your Kubernetes cluster is deployed on, bare metal under your desk or, in a full-blown environment in your data center. As long as it's CNCF, certified, you're good to go. And that's a great example to not being disruptive. So, yeah.
And you mentioned Kubernetes there, but I think there's a couple of different flavors of Arc. Would you mind explaining those?
Yeah, so Azure Arc is a set of technologies. We started with Azure Arc enabled servers, which is really about bringing the servers that you have in your data center or in a multi-cloud environment and bring those as entities to our Azure Resource Manager, to our APIs. So that's Azure Arc enabled servers. And by doing so, you're able to govern, manage, monitor, all that jazz. Then, Azure Arc enabled SQL Server, which is somewhat part of Azure Arc enabled servers, because you need to have Azure Arc enabled server in order for you to have Azure Arc enabled SQL Server. This is not data services. I'll talk about that. And this is really about bringing SQL Server instances into our control plane and start, managing those. Then you have Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, and Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes is really where things are starting to be more, to me at least, more interesting in the sense of the breadth of that solution, right? Because Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes is the fundamental building block for all the other things that I'm going to mention. When you have Kubernetes clusters that are deployed outside of Azure and you're Arc enabling those are now considered to be legit locations for you to deploy other services on top of that. So that's where data services, Azure Arc enabled data services, Azure Arc enabled app services, machine learnings, those are now taking advantage of the fact that you have an Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster. So if you have a Tanzu cluster, for example, on premises, or if you have a G-Key cluster in GCP, you can now target those clusters to deploy our own Azure services, like SQL Managed Instance or Azure Functions, Web Application, Event Grid, the list goes on. And that's really where, things are starting to be very, very interesting. And that's really the distinguish, right? You have Azure Arc enabled infrastructure, right? I'm still
Mm-hmm.
not convinced between myself and myself that I really like that distinction, but Azure Arc enabled infrastructure is really about servers and Kubernetes, but Azure Arc enabled services is really about data services, app services, machine learning, with Kubernetes being used. And the last piece is Azure Arc enabled VMware vSphere, which is our latest, Azure Arc set of technologies, which is taking a current vSphere environment and suck that environment into our control plane. We do that via something called a resource bridge, and
Mm-hmm.
that resource bridge is deployed and talk against your vCenter API, and basically able to grab all the infrastructure and all the inventory and the fleet that you have on your VMware environment and bring that into Azure, and then start doing lifecycle and management and all that stuff. So that's really, in a nutshell, the set of technologies that is Azure Arc.
Okay, that's a lot of technologies on there. So if imagine I'm a customer and I'm very new to this and I want to maybe start playing around with this just a little bit, how do I get started?
Well, so we have obviously, the things that product managers always like to say is that, yeah, go to docs. But and I really, I think the docs are great, but there is one thing that I always found a bit problematic, which is when you go to Azure Docs, a lot of the time you will get very feature-oriented
Mm-hmm.
documentations, right? Do this, do that, and this is how you are poking that feature. But to me, that was always a bit of a missing experience. So a bit more than 2 years ago, I started a project called Azure Arc Jumpstart. And that project was really about creating an experience, which is, answering the question how to get started. So that's really how to get started today. And the Azure Arc Jumpstart project back then started with the notion of, you know what, let's make sure that we're creating scenarios and not just, one documentation that is touching one specific thing in the product. Let's try to bundle few concepts together and build a scenario around that. And one of the key design principles of these scenarios is really automate the hell out of it. So making sure that you're not going to fail when you are trying those scenarios, because you know that as much as I do, Niels, when you go to, try to do something with, with a product or a feature or something like that. And I think I saw one of your tweets the other day that you said that you are trying to find something and then, 30 minutes after you're already at the sixth person or something like that. Like I saw something and
Yeah.
I didn't want to have that experience. Like I didn't want people to have that experience. So if you're going into a jumpstart scenario, you're basically, starting and finishing at the same document, and we will make sure that you're not going to fail. And no detail is too small. The level of screenshots, the automation, the code quality, everything is very rigid. Like we care about this stuff very, very much. So that's how it started, and that's really how people, should go and get started with Azure Arc. And obviously, we'll talk about more things that's got to do with the Jumpstart.
Okay. And when you mention the automation, what specifically do you refer to? Do you have like a set of pipelines to deploy your infrastructure, or do you help customers set up their own infrastructure?
Well, I guess it's a bit of both, because the scenarios that we have in the Jumpstart are designed to work with the things that you have in your data center. So, for example, I'll give you an example, right? Deploy Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes using EKS, right, on
Mm-hmm.
AWS. We'll provide you with that automation. You need to bring the account, right? That's kind of how it works, right? We're not going to provision an AWS account for you. But if you do have an account, we'll provide you with the Terraform automation, with the README, with everything, with all this bundling, so you can go and do that, right? So that's just one example. But on the flip side, we also have solutions, scenarios, and also another product that is part of the Jumpstart family, which is called RBox. What we're going to do is we're going to provision that infrastructure for you on top of Azure, and we're going to simulate either an on-premises environment or a multi-cloud environment for you. So all you need to do is to bring your own subscription, and that's it. We'll provision everything for you, and we'll do all the Arc simulations, so you will get a full-blown environment of Azure Arc, so we can start benefit out of that.
Okay. Would you mind showing me
Sure.
some of the scenarios?
Sure, of course. So here I am. This is the Jumpstart page, right? And like I said, or I did mention that this is a full open source project. You can go see the code, everything that we're doing. It's based on GitHub, so no problems there. So let's talk about this there. So as you can see here in the scenarios, we have multiple categories, right, for Azure Arc. Like I mentioned, we have few things with Azure Arc and Azure Arc technologies, and we're trying to touch each and every one of those. We're currently working on more things, so that's why you don't see yet VMware vSphere and some other stuff that we're working on. But generally speaking, these scenarios are structured as categories. And if I'll go to, let's just take an example, right? Azure Arc enabled servers. The way that scenarios are built, the way that we structure this is to have two categories: onboarding scenarios and unified operations, or day two, if you may.
Mm-hmm.
The onboarding scenarios talks about how do I get to a point that I have, in this case, Azure Arc enabled server on my infrastructure, right? And as you can see, we support all these type of infrastructures, right? And the way that we are deploying this, like the method that we're using, depends on the infrastructure that you are targeting, right? So if I'll go to, let's just take Google Cloud Platform, for example. You have Ubuntu GCP, you have Windows GCP instance. So we'll go to Ubuntu. And here you're going to start seeing the fact that we're actually telling you, and this is one of the core elements of, the Jumpstart, we're actually going to show you how things are done on GCP. That's not something that you will find in Azure Docs. There's no way you will be able to find this in Azure Docs, which is one of the differentiators that we have. And so we're going to go and teach you everything. And this is a very, lengthy document, but honestly, at the end of the day, it's a single click deployment. We just want to give you the details so you will know what is happening, because that's another, thing that I found a bit missing, that I wanted better explanations. I wanted to understand what is happening. And to me, that was something that was a bit missing. So that's really the onboarding scenario. But then we have unified operations use cases. And this is where rubber meets the road, how we like to say it. This is where how you actually using Azure Arc, again, in the context of Azure Arc enabled servers, that's what I'm showing right now. That's how you are taking advantage of the value proposition of Azure Arc, right? Because Azure Arc is not just about onboarding those servers into our control plane or those Kubernetes clusters. It's what is it that you're doing with it. That's really what's important. And these are the unified operations use cases that you're seeing here. So things like, okay, so how do you use Microsoft Cloud Defender with this? How do I do resource tagging at scale? What's the deal with, how do I do Azure Private Link? And the list goes on and on and on, because there's so many things that you can do. And that's really, again, the premise of Azure Arc. We want you to take your resources, but take advantage of Azure capabilities. And that's really, what you're seeing here. So these are these are the scenarios. And currently today we have more than 100 scenarios. We just reached that milestone. And I think, Niels, you contributed one of the scenarios. I think it was like kind with Azure Kubernetes, which is actually, it's still there, and it's actually being deployed. You will love to to hear that. And this is the scenario that you wrote back then, and it's still being used, right?
Oh yeah, I still see my name in there.
You still see your name in there, right? And that's still being used. And that's really another key element of the Jumpstart. It's a community-driven project, right? So everyone can come, contribute scenarios. We have guidelines on how do we go by and build those scenarios. And I think you remember that by talking to me when you were, working on these scenarios. But yeah, that's really kind of how we are approaching this. So yeah, that's why I meant when I said that a lot has happened since you and I talked, because today we have more than 100 scenarios, and also obviously ArcBox. So yeah,
that's cool. So how do you differentiate ArcBox from all of the individual scenarios then?
Yeah, so ArcBox is really the evolution of the scenarios that we started with. So when we started the Jumpstart project, we were focusing on the scenarios, right? So I think it was around 40 scenarios when we started working on ArcBox, and we released that somewhere around the 50 scenarios. ArcBox is really a bundle deployment of multiple scenarios that are coming together. I always like to think about it like, for the geeks that are watching this, like if you're thinking about Voltron, that you have like multiple mini Voltrons coming together and building this mega Voltron. That's really what RBox is, because we're taking multiple scenarios, we're bundling those together. But the main thing about RBox is really the fact that you're bringing your own subscription. We don't
Mhm.
ask you to have an AWS account. We don't ask you to have a GCP account. You don't need to have a full-blown VMware environment. RBox is really deployed on your subscription. And RBox today has two flavors. We have the full flavor, and as you can see, we have multiple architecture diagrams there. The full flavor will go and deploy everything that is Azure Arc on your subscription. It's a pretty beefy deployment. And recently we started or we announced the notion of RBox flavors. And RBox flavors really designed to touch specific personas in the organization that wants to benefit from Azure Arc, but don't want to have the entire Azure RBox full edition, which, like I said, it's pretty beefy. So then we came with the next flavor, which is RBox for IT pros. And as you can see, it's a slimmed down version, which has only the Azure Arc enabled servers portion and all the unified operation layer on top of that, right? So that's really, what I said when I meant the value proposition. Because if you look at all these use cases that we have of unified operation, we're bringing that into RBox and deploy that. And
So,
RBox
Lior,
is
if I can interrupt you there, does that mean that in Arcbox you don't only provide the plumbing, like you create a couple servers and you onboard those into Arc, but you also enable all of those unified operation scenarios? So
correct.
you onboard the servers into managed identity, Azure policy, Sentinel.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Yes. Everything is deployed for you. The automation, the level of automation that goes into RBox is pretty impressive. There's a lot of things that needs to be taken under consideration. And if you look at the specific page, right, for RBox, this is the full edition, which is, again, coming back to no detail is too small. We also want you to understand what is it that you are deploying, like why we're doing things the way we do things. So it's not just about giving you, hey, click this and let's hope it's going to work. We also provide you with the troubleshooting guidelines, what are the consumption flows, like all the things that you need to take under consideration. Also, the automation flow, like what is happening when you're deploying this. And this is for a lot of people, this is, too much information. One can argue. And that's why, at the end of the day, it's a single-click deployment. And today, RBox supports ARM, Bicep, and Terraform. And soon we will have full integration into the portal. So yeah.
Oh, wow, that is pretty impressive. So I know it'll take us too long to actually deploy this here live, but would you mind showing us what it looks like for a customer if they would want to deploy RBox?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Let me open the portal, and we'll take a look at what we have. I actually have a deployment handy of the new flavor that we're coming up with, and so what you see here is part of a demo that I'm working on. And as you can see here, this is,
Would you mind
there's a lot.
zooming in a little bit?
Yeah, of course. And
Yeah,
we
that's
have a
better.
lot of resources that are being deployed. You will notice, and I know, Niels, you're in the Kubernetes place. You will notice that we're using Cluster API as the backend for deploying a lot of the services that we're deploying. We'll have Rancher K3S as part of it, to just kind of show the versatility of the solution. And this is how it's going to look like when you're deploying this. So a lot of things are happening in the background. But one thing cool that you will notice is that we're also taking care of the fact that you have Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster already onboarded. And obviously, there are use cases that we're providing you with the README on what is it that you're about to do with this. So it's not just about deploying the resources. It's also about showing you what, so, okay, so this is a GitOps scenario. This is, open service mesh. This is Azure policy. Like, how do you do this type of stuff using the automation that we are providing you? So, yeah, it's a pretty big solution, but it's also super cool and people really enjoy it.
Okay, cool. This has been super insightful. I already put the link to the Jumpstart in our chat here on YouTube. But are there any other resources you would want to point people towards?
Well, honestly, I think that, if you look at the Jumpstart suite of solutions, today we have, our own YouTube channel. We have a show, Jumpstart Lightning. That's another thing to look at. The YouTube channel also have a bunch of demos when I'm talking to people like yourself from the community and having a conversation, fun conversation about things that's got to do with hybrid technologies and how they're actually leveraging that. There are multiple Pluralsight courses that that are out there written by some of our colleagues. But yeah, go and check the Jumpstart. Everything that you need is there, and you can just start enjoying Azure Arc.
Okay, fantastic. And before we round things off, is there any final thing you would like to highlight to the audience?
Well, come watch us at Build. We are preparing some cool stuff for you. So May 24 to May 26. Other than that, just keep watching this space. There's a lot of things.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming on, Lior. This was super insightful, and for me personally, given that I contributed just one of your 100 scenarios, it's really great to see how things have evolved over, I think, the year since I worked with you. So
Yeah,
great work, and
thanks
thanks
so
for
much
coming
for
on the
having
show.
me. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Cool. See y'all, and thanks for joining us.